I just created a collection of 8 of my very own spooky keyboard sounds that you can get right now. They work with Ableton Live. And today I want to show you how you can create your own instruments as well, and some of the sound design techniques I used in creating these sounds. I will also have a painting update for you all, as I know some of you in the comments ask, and it's been a while since I had an excuse to show you my paintings, but yeah, that'll come later because today's video is sponsored by Skillshare, and I'll tell you all about that later. Let's jump to an instrument called Casper. I really like that sound. That's just the dry snapshot, but there is a cursed snapshot. Each one of the sounds in this collection of instruments has 4 snapshots, which in some way transform the sound. And jumping to one more sound from the collection called Are, you will notice these macros. There's 4 macros for each instrument, which have the potential to totally transform the instrument. And they each do different things. Like, let me crank the spooky here on the Are instrument. You're gonna hear like that pitch fluctuation there. That's present across many of the instruments in this collection, and it's using the LFO tool in Ableton Live. And I should mention, I built all these instruments to be compatible with devices that you get in Live Intro, Standard, and Suite. So most people should be able to use these instruments no problem. I think I used to be scared of the LFO, and maybe many of you have had the same experience. What is the LFO? How can we use it properly? Well, let's talk about that quickly, and let's do that by actually creating a brand new instrument. So starting from an empty MIDI track, I am actually going to go into my Ghost Wave folder and find some of the one-shot samples that I used to even make this. I think that's a totally good place to start. Simple one-shot key sample that you also get in the pack with the instruments. You get all 8 one-shot samples. So I've covered this concept before in my Ableton Live for Beginner series, which you can all check out, making your own like one-shot sample instrument. So I've got this one-shot sample in Simpler. Let's bring the release up. Just gonna fade all the way out through the sound. And like I said, let's investigate this LFO effect. And what is an LFO? I actually think this is overly confusing for most people learning music production in 2023, because LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. And many of you might associate an oscillator with a synthesizer, like the oscillator is one of the sound generators, essentially. So it's called low frequency oscillator. So if I add this to my device, am I adding some type of low frequency to my device? No, I could be getting this wrong, but I think in olden times with older synths, they used the signal from a low frequency oscillator, which is essentially an oscillator you cannot hear, the human ear could not hear, and they used that to change different parameters because oscillators, as you can see here, have a wave shape. So no, we're not adding any low frequencies to our sounds. We're not adding any frequencies at all. We're simply using the shape and the speed of a wave to adjust certain parameters. Now in lo-fi music, one distinct feature of certain keyboard sounds is making them sound like they came from a tape, which gives them sort of a pitch wobble effect. We don't want to automate it. That would be like very arduous to automate that over time. So let's instead map the LFO to the detune. That is the essential function of an LFO. By itself, it's not going to do anything. We need to map it to something. So I'm going to click the map button and I'm going to click the detune. Now you can see that number changing rapidly. If I play some notes, the number's going crazy all over the place. And there's a couple parameters we can use to adjust how this actually works. The first being 0 to 100. The percentage is going to be the amount that this thing is allowed to change. If I go 0, 0, you can see that it just stalls and stops at a number. If I bring that up a bit, you can see that the range of numbers, well, if you can watch that fast enough, the range will increase. It's going to increase all the way from -50 cents to +50 cents. So that's one way we could adjust. We can adjust the overall range that it's allowed to go. We can also adjust the rate, how fast it's going to go. You can see that's getting represented by the picture of this wave and how fast those numbers are crazily changing. Let's bring it all the way down and just increase it a little bit. You can see how slow that wave is moving. Right now we're doing this by hertz, which is sort of independent of the project time. If you wanted to do it in time with the project, you could switch to this little musical note button, which will allow you to pick time divisions. So it'll always be synced to a specific tempo. So let's choose something slow for now. In fact, for this tape effect, we don't really want it to be like in time. So let's choose a slow rate. It's going pretty fast for a tape wobble effect. And it's also quite extreme. So if we want it to not be as extreme, meaning the lows not being so low and the highs not being so different from those lows, we can bring the depth down. If we want this to have a little bit more randomness to it, we can add a jitter, which will maintain this general sine shape, but it'll add these little random peaks and valleys in there. To me, I think that creates a pretty realistic tape pitch wobble. I'm going to increase the depth so it's very obvious. And I should also mention that there's other wave shapes here. And there's also a smooth percentage, which if we're using smooth, we probably don't really need jitter. But I guess you could, like, instead of it being super jittery, you could have it smooth and jittery. Whichever you prefer. But if we already have a smooth sine wave, it's kind of just going to flatten that sine wave. It's a little bit similar, I think, to the depth. I could be wrong. Synth nerds, you can let me know. But for this specific effect, I think increasing the jitter makes a lot of sense because it gives it that irregularity, not just a smooth sine wave. Now that's just one aspect that we're using the LFO for. You can go crazy if I open this little menu here, and you can see that we have a bunch of other slots that we're able to map towards. So you could have one LFO mapped to a bunch of different parameters. You can get really crazy with it. But I want you to notice that on this blue lady key instrument, one of the instruments from my Spectral Keys pack, there is a pitch drift macro knob. This is actually just increasing the depth on the LFO, a very similar LFO to what we've just sent. You can see increasing the macro makes the depth go from 0 to 100. So when you open this instrument up, you don't have to go into the LFO, find the depth, and then increase it. You have a macro here called pitch drift that you can increase yourself. So how do we set this up? First, let's go back to the instrument we're creating right now. Let's click the title bar of our simpler, and let's hold Shift and click the title bar of the LFO. Right click, Group. Now these are in an instrument rack. Ultimately, this is how we can create like more complex instruments. So for the macro, we can click on the little tiny macro icon. We know that Ableton loves their tiny icons. And we can click the map button, which puts us into a mapping mode similar to the MIDI mapping modes we've used before. But this is mainly for mapping things internally in the instrument rack. So let's click on the depth and let's click map on macro 1. That is now the depth of our LFO, which is adjusting our detune. We'll have 0 here when it's set to 0. No pitch fluctuation at all. Increase the depth. Lots of pitch fluctuation. And you can rename these macros. Pitch drift. And you can change the color of these macros as well. And creating these macros goes for any effect you might put in a rack. You might put a reverb in the rack, drop that in there. And you might want to map, again, going into the map mode of the instrument rack. You might want to map the dry wet of the reverb right here. Now we have a reverb dry wet in our macros. Really simple macro mapping there. Going back to mapping here, I just want you to notice that we have minimum and maximum values. So if you didn't want the pitch to get too out of hand, maybe you think the most it should be is 70%, you could set it there. Same thing for the reverb. You could even reverse these so that the minimum is 100 and the maximum is 0. This can be useful for different types of effects, but when the macro is set to 0 now, it's at 100% reverb. Increasing it takes the reverb away. So you can have these be inverse from each other. Looking back at some of the instruments from Spectral Keys, you will notice and remember that there are these snapshots here. This essentially makes every instrument, every individual instrument has 4 presets within it. And I'm going to show you how to set up those snapshots right after I give you a little painting update and tell you about the sponsor for today's video, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes and members all coming together to find inspiration and take the next step in their creative journey. They've got a mission of making a creative life possible for everybody. And if you're watching this video, you're probably interested in music production, maybe making your own sound design, and Skillshare's got classes for that, taught by great teachers, even some by Ableton certified trainers. For me, I was looking to discover a new skill on Skillshare, so I started watercolor painting. And they've got some great beginners courses, and I watched a few of the beginners classes, and now I've been painting for a couple years and I'm still improving my skills. It feels really great to have an outlet besides music and take a step in a different creative direction. The next class I'll take on Skillshare will likely be around drawing because I really need to hone those skills, and they've got a great beginner drawing course called Start Drawing, 3 fun, freeing exercises to spark your creativity. What I think is cool about this class is you can also see some of the class projects. You can see some of the work that people created after taking the class. And that's really inspiring. It shows that like it's a real community and you can see what other people are working on. But there's such a wide breadth of classes. We've already talked about music production, and then we jumped to making art, and there's even entrepreneurial minded classes. Maybe you're trying to pick up a new skill like coding, or if you're getting into being a freelancer, entrepreneurship, things like that. They've got classes around that too. And the first 1,000 of my subscribers who use the link down in the description will get a free 1-month trial of Skillshare. So why not just take advantage of that? A 1-month free trial. Try a new skill, try a different type of class, try a new art that you're not so familiar with, try learning a new skill that could maybe get you a new job. It's all available there on Skillshare. You've got the free month, use the link in the description, and I would love to hear if you do develop a new skill in the comments down below. When you support the sponsor, you support the channel, so use the link in the description, get that free 1 month. You might as well just take a chance and try something new. If it works out, you've got a new skill. All right, let's get back into making some instruments. So this synth sound is called Casper, but it's got 4 snapshots, and the snapshot we're on is called speaking because it has like that talking sound to it. If we switch back to dry, it kind of loses all that character. If we go to haunted, it'll be a slightly spookier sound, and cursed will be a more broken sound. And you probably noticed as I select each one of those snapshots, the macros are changing. This is something we have the power to do in Ableton Live 11. So let's just jump back to the specific instrument we were making before. And remember that we've set up 2 macros here, one for pitch drift and one for reverb. And click the little tiny snapshot icon. If you don't have a magnifying glass, you might miss it. When we enter into this snapshots menu, you're going to get a list of macro variations, but we don't have any yet. So we're going to click new, and that automatically creates variation 1. Now this variation, this snapshot, is going to be whatever these macros are. So if I change these macros, you're going to see a little star appear indicating that we have changed that variation. But let me click new. And when I click play on variation 1, it brings us back to that original state. On variation 2, it brings us back to that 0 state, which we've just changed. If I change it at all, I can hit the snapshot button again, and now it's saved that snapshot. You can rename these. So let's make this like as if we're making real snapshots here. You would want to make one that is completely dry, 0% everything. Hit the snapshot button, boom. Let's create another one that's totally 100% wet. Well, I guess it's the opposite because of the way the reverb is. Let's hit new again. Let's do one that is just going to give us pitch drift. So I can hit Command R, call this pitch drift. I hit that snapshot button and I'll make sure it saves that way. This one here is only reverb. In variation 1 here, let's actually change that so there's 0 reverb because I inverted the knob to show that earlier, but snapshot that and call this one dry. So now we're on the dry setting. We're not hearing any of our effects. Let's go to the reverb setting, 100% reverb version. Let's go to pitch drift. I left the reverb at 100% here. Let's change that to 0 just to demo this. There's only a pitch drifted version. So any combination of your macros, any setting that you put can be saved as a new variation, a new snapshot, giving you essentially presets for your instrument. Each one of my instruments in Spectral Keys has 4 different snapshots, so that's essentially 4 presets per sound. And they each add some interesting dimension. Some completely changing the sound. But you're also free to go and change and move those macros as you wish, and you could even create your own new snapshots for them. Now, one thing to note here, you'll notice that in the instrument we're making today, we only used 2 macros. In my instruments, there are 4 macros, but it looks nice and neat. There's no extra macros. That is because we can subtract these macros. It subtracts them 2 at a time, starting from 7 and 8, 7 and 8, 5 and 6, and then 3 and 4. We can get rid of them, and now we only see our 2 macros. And you can even add more macros if you're really building out a monster rack here. And you can actually even go down to 0. And by 0, I meant 1. So I hope that was a helpful look at creating your own instruments. I just spent a lot of time creating my own instruments with this Spectral Keys pack that you can pick up at the link in the description. If you like the sound of my music, I think you'll like the sound of each of these keyboard instruments. But I hope that you're also inspired to go make your own instruments. And by the way, I've included 8 one-shots within the pack with the instruments. So you could take any of these single one-shot sounds and make your own instruments with them using the process that we just learned today. So in addition to the 8 instruments in Spectral Keys, you can go ahead and make your own instruments with the one-shot samples included in the pack. Thank you again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. There's lots of great classes on there, so go check them out at the link in the description. Support the sponsor, you're supporting the channel. Maybe it's time to pick up a new skill. Who can say? Shout out to all my members. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been TAETRO. Have a good one.